So I was told that my title is a bit serious and great, so I'm going to go ahead and just explain it real quick. So neoliberalism is largely an ideology of the political, social economic ideology that based itself on society being organized around free market principles. So basically state withdrawal, public institutions like that, that kind of thing. And social response is basically how did these people in Costa Rica respond to how that happened, or to when that happened, and starting in the early 1980s, and then kind of progressing from there. And then it's preliminary simply because it's not that extensive. I did 15 interviews and I stayed in the field for a month. I was in Costa Rica for 4 months, but I stayed with the people for 4 months. And this picture is Neoliberalism, and this was in San Jose, and where I studied, the programs were located right next to the university, so there were a lot of radical sentiments around the TERCE, and the TERCE is the CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which was ratified in 2007, which basically opened CAFTA, Costa Rica up to free trade with America. It's kind of an historical context to my study there. So since probably the last 30 years or so, there's been this kind of like greater acceptance of organizing your economy according to these free market principles, and that also inevitably entails kind of the withdrawal of state participation in society. And then when this happened in the 1980s in Costa Rica, after the economy crashed and had international financial institutions coming in and kind of giving them advice on how to restructure their economy again, then what happened was that there was a lot of decreased support for farmers in Costa Rica, which they were basically used to having the state being a significant player in their subsistence, simply because they provided price supports and credits for them a lot, and they would set, for example, the market price at a higher than what the free market would for them. So it's just like a safer environment to be in. And then when this took place, there was some peasant mobilization in 1981, which kind of protested a lot against these reforms. And that was on the behest of UPA Nacional, which was formed basically as a peasant organization against these free trade reforms. And then generally the Central American Free Trade Agreement, the CAFTA, can kind of be seen as a culmination of these general trends. So you can see the credits falling for the farmers a lot. So I guess I should start on point theater first, because that would make more sense. I went there to study how the political process that led up to the CAFTA through the referendum was affected by different political power relationships. So I went in there with the hypothesis that political freedom during the referendum was basically a function of your work. So if you were a poor farmer or a poor wage laborer, you would have less freedom to vote what you wanted to vote during the CAFTA. And that was based on a lot of conversations I had when I got there. For example, the government released this Memorandum del Miedo, Memorandum of Fear, which basically stated that different mayors and different factory owners should kind of scare their laborers into voting yes for the CAFTA. So I did this in Tapasco Ruiz, which is a farming community, a lot of farming, potato, onion, lettuce, and so on. And I did 15 interviews, a lot of participant observation, just like hanging out, and I read a lot of secondary literature too. So when I first got to Salcedo, I found out that it was very difficult to get to talk to different factory owners. There were only a couple of big ones in the region too. And though there was one group working there, the Patriotic Committee, that was extremely opposed to these reforms. They were giving me signs that this was obviously going on in this community too, but it was very difficult to actually get to talk to someone that could verify that. So after a while, I had to kind of shift my focus a little bit, and I wanted to focus on just how this farming community actually reacted to these various reforms that have been going on. So this is largely a descriptive study. Simply, I make observations, and I can only suggest things simply because I was there for only a month, and it's difficult to draw any tangible conclusions about what's here. So this was my whole study. This is kind of how it looked like. This was the church in the neighborhood. So the two dominant farming groups there, Apuda and Grupo Nacional. They were both strongly opposed to the Costa, obviously, but they related to it in very, very different ways. So we had the Asociación de Productores Orgánicos de Alfaro Ruiz, which was perhaps the most radical of the two. Read that. So you can see that he declares himself kind of like an enemy of the state, and that there's an outright rejection of the COFTA national politics. So Apuda decided not to vote in the COFTA at all. And they also attempted to eliminate the intermediary. Now the intermediary is a big problem for a lot of these farmers because they work and they produce everything, and then these intermediaries come in and they can basically charge whatever price they want to because these farmers need to bring the produce to the market. And they don't have the time to do that themselves. So in order for them to gain anything from being a farmer, they completely depend on these intermediaries, and a lot more than they depend on anyone else, including the government. And then you have Grupo Nacional, which was the first farming organization that started kind of rebelling against these reforms in the 1980s. It was interesting to see here that it had more accepted the situation that they were in than the Grupo Nacional. And they kind of based all their arguments in this market rhetoric. So they kind of like supported, the logic of supply and demand, and there was really no way to fight it except to go with the flow. And they were also more complacent with the intermediary, that there was no way they could actually eliminate it. So the way I kind of approached this study was to view these changes, or what Alfaro look like right now, as kind of a result of the changes that have been going on in the economy over the last 30 or 40 years. And I can't really draw that tangible link between what happened in the reforms and exactly the change that has been going on over that 30 years. But I think it's helpful to view it through that lens of globalization, kind of connect the global to the very local on that level. And it's also been large divide between the government and peasants after that. There's also a lot of animosity between the two farming organizations. So in that sense, I'd suggest that because there's this divide between government and peasants, how does that affect political participation, for example, and voter turnout? And therefore also, how does that affect democracy in this town? Thank you.